anybody wants to reposition chairs so you can see, she does have a PowerPoint with some pictures and different. Short here. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, so thank you all for letting me speak today. I will let you know I'm not a great public speaker, so we'll give it a go. So most of you probably know who I am, but I want to take just a little bit of time to share a small bit about myself so you can understand just how spectacularly ordinary my life was. I was born and raised in Tipton. After graduation, I went on to school at State Fair Community College, and then later to Northwest Missouri State University, where I earned my teaching degree. Glutton for punishment, I went back a few years later and received my master's degree from William Woods. I've been a high school social studies teacher since 2006 at Pleasant Hill High School. In 2011, I married my wonderful husband, Chris, and 2 years later, we welcomed our daughter, Eliana, into the world. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, why did they ask this lady to speak? She seems pretty boring. Before Eliana, I lived a wonderful life, but admittedly, it was an ordinary life, one without much purpose. The life I knew vanished on New Year's Eve of 2013, when Eliana entered the world as a 4-pound, 7-ounce diva. Eliana would spend the first 5 months of her life in the neonatal ICU at Children's Mercy Hospital, suffering from uncontrolled epilepsy and other medical complications. While in the NICU, Eliana would receive a genetic diagnosis of SCN2A-related epileptic encephalopathy. My life had just become extraordinary. Now, one of the very ordinary things about my life is that I love quotes. I have quotes posted all throughout my classroom, and I have multiple Pinterest boards dedicated solely to quotes that inspire me. Today, I'm going to be sharing several quotes that I have tied to 4 lessons that I have learned throughout my new, anything but ordinary life as a special needs parent. So lesson 1, just keep going. So I've never been a fan of winter. Every year in the middle of another brutal Missouri winter, like the one we're having this year, I question why I still live here. January of 2014 was no different. It was bitter cold, and unbeknownst to us, the beginning of what would be a 5-month-long stay at Children's Mercy Hospital. By the end of January, almost a month into our stay, we still didn't have answers for why Eliana was having hundreds of seizures a day, and despite multiple anti-epileptic medications, and the stress was starting to get to Chris and I. We began to question how we would ever get through this seemingly endless and terrifying experience. On January 21st, during one of my daily vigils at Eliana's bedside, I happened upon a quote someone had posted on Facebook in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The quote was from a 1967 speech he gave in Cleveland. Dr. King was very eloquently said, "We must keep going. And so, if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, keep moving." I vividly remember reading this quote and feeling like it was meant just for me, to encourage me through this difficult time. Just a few days later, we would receive earth-shattering news, Eliana's genetic diagnosis. Even though not much was known about SCN2A at the time, the prognosis was not good. We were told by a genetic counselor that she would likely not live to see her 2nd birthday, and if she did, her quality of life would be very poor. Diagnosis day, sometimes referred to as D-Day in special needs circles, was the worst day of what would be the longest winter of our lives. Since the initial genetic diagnosis, numerous other diagnoses have followed for Eliana. One of them is a diagnosis of dysautonomia, which causes Eliana to have an overactive sympathetic nervous system. Now, if you don't know, the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for your fight or flight response. This is our body's physiological response to stress. For Eliana, when her body encounters stress, like say a tummy ache, her body jumps into fight mode and cannot get out without medical intervention. When staring down adversity, much like Eliana's sympathetic nervous system, we have two choices. We can fight or we can fly, we can run. We can run from the threat, try to avoid pain and survive to live another day. This flight response can prove quite useful when dealing with temporary threats. Like this past summer when I was cleaning out our long neglected garage and stumbled upon a hive of very protective bees. I chose that day to run. I got away from the threat as quickly as possible and lived to clean another day. Unfortunately, many threats in our lives are not temporary. They're long-lasting and life-altering, and that flight response simply won't do. The other choice we can make is to face the threat head-on, to fight. This option, which opens us up to the possibility of pain and potential injury, also provides us with the opportunity to weaken or even eliminate the threat. As the poet Robert Frost said, the best way out is always through. I must admit, there were times in the early days of being in the NICU that I wanted to run from the threat of an uncertain future and daily life-threatening crises. Many evenings, when we should have been snuggling Eliana in the comfort of our home, enjoying our newborn baby, we sat in an empty nursery, crying and grieving the life that we had meticulously planned for our new family, while our daughter fought for her life in a hospital across town. Early on, Chris and I made the conscious decision that we must face this threat head on. That while we might want to run and hide, we must stand and fight. So every morning we woke up, got dressed, and made the trek across town to Children's Mercy to spend the day fighting with Eliana. At this point, we were just crawling, and we crawled for months. But we were still going. We were still moving forward. We were still fighting. So no matter how long the winter may seem or how terrifying the threat may be, in the immortal words of Dory, a small blue fish, just keep swimming. Lesson 2, accept help. While we were slowly moving forward, I quickly realized how isolating our journey was going to be. Research has shown that people who have unique experiences tend to report less positive feelings and a sense of exclusion compared to those with shared but ordinary experiences. This is the reality of a special needs family. Because our daily lives are so much different from a typical family, many times it's hard for others to relate to us and for us to relate to them. When you compound this with all the other obstacles we face on a daily basis, maintaining relationships becomes all the more difficult and the feelings of isolation start to settle in. I believe at some point we all experience a degree of isolation, a time where we feel detached, like no one could understand what we're going through. For some, maybe this is as an angsty teen, trying to navigate social groups and figure out where you fit in. For others, maybe that disconnect comes as an adult, trying to cope with an empty nest or the loss of a loved one. I've discovered that while it may seem like you are alone in your situation, there's always someone who can empathize. There's always someone willing to help. You just have to be open to accepting that help when it's presented. An African proverb says that it takes a village to raise a child. This implies that we can't do everything ourselves, that we must be willing to accept help. This is not something that comes naturally to me. For the 5 months Eliana spent in the NICU, I was granted extended leave from work so that I could be with her. While I was very fortunate to have an employer who was willing to grant me this leave, it also meant several months without pay. Knowing the potential financial burden we were about to experience, my village stepped in to help. I may have been 31 years old, married, and living in a different city, but in the eyes of the Tipton community that helped to raise me, I was just a child from their village that needed help. Chris and I were truly humbled by the outpouring of love and support we were shown from this amazing community. But it was still very difficult to accept this seemingly undeserved kindness. I think from an early age, we all desire independence. like the toddler who insists they can do everything themselves, or the teenager who ignores sage advice from their parents because they believe that they know it all. I was no different. I believed that I should be able to care for my child and continue in my roles as wife, teacher, and coach without any extra support, because that's what mothers are supposed to do. No matter how much I thought I could do it all, I quickly was shown that I was wrong. I was immediately denied the chance to do even the most basic tasks expected of new mothers, like holding, feeding, bathing, even dressing my child. Because of Eliana's condition early on, these tasks were carried out by highly skilled nurses and even medical equipment. I did not get to hold Eliana until she was 3 days old. Believe me, I've been making up for those 3 days for the past 5 years. Not being able to adequately care for my child made me feel like a failure. And as our hospital stay went from days to weeks to months, I realized that other roles that I was used to doing were going to also be challenged. I had to take an entire semester off from teaching. I would no longer be able to coach. And how could I juggle all of these things and still be a good wife? So when my village, the Tipton community, my co-workers, family, and friends started to offer help, I struggled to accept it, because in my mind, accepting help was showing weakness and was forcing me to acknowledge my own shortcomings. Shortly after we got home from the NICU, I discovered an online Facebook community that was started by a handful of parents whose children suffered from the same genetic change as Eliana. Now, earlier I had mentioned that research has shown that people with unique experiences, like we were having, tend to feel isolated and have an increase in negative feelings. But conversely, research also shows that positive feelings can be amplified through shared experiences. Researchers found that people who share the act of eating a piece of chocolate together with another person actually report enjoying it more than when they ate it alone. Discovering my SCN2A family meant I was no longer eating my chocolate alone. I was now sharing my experience with people who understood and can offer me unique support that I couldn't find anywhere else. My village had now grown. Over the past 5 years, that village has become more like a booming metropolis, growing exponentially to include countless doctors, nurses, teachers, therapists, all who have filled in areas where I am lacking, just to make our lives complete. Throughout this journey, I've come to the realization that accepting help is not a weakness. It actually takes an immense amount of strength to not only confront your shortcomings, but then to allow people to share in your experience. So whatever you're battling, don't do it alone. Find your village and eat your chocolate together. Lesson 3, let go of expectations. Speaking of eating chocolate, when I was pregnant with Eliana, 4 of my colleagues were also expecting children, with our due dates landing within 4 months of one another. While some were questioning what was in the water at Pleasant Hill High School that year, I was busy making plans for Eliana and her future. Plans were made for her to attend a local babysitter that some of my colleagues' children would also attend. So in my head, Eliana already had a group of friends and she hadn't even arrived yet. I was killing it as a parent. But like all parents, I was just envisioning our future. But in looking ahead, I was also creating expectations. Expectations of what our lives would be like, who Eliana would become. But to paraphrase the Scottish poet Robert Burns, the best laid plans often go awry. In the 5 long months we spent in the NICU after Eliana's birth, in an effort to try and fill the hours while I sat at Eliana's bedside, I would scroll through social media. As I scrolled through Facebook weeks after Eliana was born, my first expecting colleague welcomed a healthy child into the world. Then a few weeks later, another colleague welcomed another healthy baby into the world. And this continued until all 4 of my colleagues had uneventfully welcomed healthy children into the world. This should have been a time filled with great joy. But as I watched my colleagues' children grow and reach milestones, like cooing and laughing and setting independently, I was watching Eliana have hundreds of seizures a day and being confronted with the reality that she may never get to go home. I found myself in a very dark and uncomfortable place, a place where my expectations for my daughter and her future weren't being met. And I was unfairly comparing her to these children because of the expectations that I had created. Teddy Roosevelt once said that comparison is the thief of joy. Without realizing it, comparison was stealing joy from my experience as a new mother. I couldn't fully appreciate Eliana and our journey because I was too consumed with what we would never have and what she would never be. When the Bible was originally translated from Hebrew to Greek, there were 4 words that were used to describe the English word love. Eros to describe romantic love, philia to describe brotherly love, storge to describe familial love, and the 4th and most important type of love, agape. Agape is a love that is selfless and sacrificial, a love that is unconditional. Many equate it to the love Christ had for his Father and for humankind. Pope Francis embraces the concept of agape love when he addresses the issue of giving to the poor. His message was simple: give to the poor and don't worry about it. Many people justify not giving to the poor because they might squander the money. But Pope Francis argues we should simply give to those in need and be grateful we have the ability to do so. This is giving love unconditionally, without judgment or expectation. 5 years in, I'm finally at a point in our journey where I can say that I'm starting to let go of unrealistic expectations that I had created for Eliana, and I'm starting to replace those with open-ended possibilities of what she might become. By removing those unfair expectations, I am now free to love Eliana unconditionally, and that has been transformative for me. I can now find joy in our experience because I'm no longer focused on what she is not and what she will never become. So try not to get caught up in what everyone else has and what you don't. Accept others for who they are, not what you think they should be. Once you begin to shed those expectations, you too can open yourself up to give and receive unconditional agape love. Last lesson. Embrace your experience. So letting go of expectations is a process that I'm still navigating. There are days that those expectations creep in and make an unwanted appearance. I think this is part of the grieving process that every special needs family goes through. Even though Eliana is very much alive, the expectations that I had created about who she would be were never viable. And I find myself on occasion grieving the child who never was. Like when the genetic counselor shared our bleak prognosis, when attending a well child checkup at the pediatrician and having to answer no over and over again when asked if Eliana is hitting milestones, or while in the middle of a 2-week stay in the PICU, when I had to sit and watch through a glass wall for hours as the family across the hall said goodbye to their child for the last time. I think experts are wrong when they say that the grieving process comes in stages. To me, this implies that there is a beginning, middle, and end to grieving. I think a more appropriate term is that grief comes in waves. I know for me, my grieving comes in waves. It's intermittent and unpredictable. Sometimes these waves are small and fleeting. Other times they're long and lingering. And like waves crashing into rocks along the shore, each time a small bit of erosion takes place, reshaping my experience. There are many aspects to our journey that are painful and at times hard to bear. But I can't control these things, just like I can't control when my grief decides to reappear. But what I can control is how I respond to these situations. The English philosopher George Henry Lewes said, "The only cure for grief is action." I've tried to make this my motto. 4 years ago, I decided to embrace our experience and try to find some way to repay all the kindness that has been shown to our family. We decided to start a yearly golf tournament that would raise funds and awareness for various worthy causes. 3 years ago, I was approached by the family's SCN2A Foundation and asked to become a board member and help them achieve their vision of finding a cure for SCN2A disorders. The Eliana's Force Golf Tournament and my work with the family's SCN2A Foundation are actions that I can control, and in my own small way, I can help others navigate their hardships while helping heal the wounds my own have created. By embracing my experience, I'm allowing the waves of grief to shape me into a better version of myself. The Persian poet and scholar Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." No one can escape grief, pain, and hardship. We all experience them throughout our lives at some level. We all have wounds. So if these things are inevitable, we must be willing to embrace those experiences, to allow the light to enter so that we can be transformed into something better. Now for the cute pictures. Before Eliana was born, I had a wonderful life, but I now know that it was a life unfulfilled. Eliana and our special needs experience has transformed my life from ordinary to extraordinary, and it's helped shape me into a better version of myself. You know, life has a way of testing us. Along with happiness and joy, it also brings pain and hardship. My hope for you is that when you encounter times of trial, that you remember these 4 lessons. No matter how difficult it may seem, just keep going. Seek out and find your village and accept their help when offered. Don't allow unfair expectations to limit your love or squash your joy. And finally, embrace what you're going through so that you can learn from it and become a better version of yourself. Thank you.